I'm a bit of a product marketing nerd, if you can't tell from my involvement in the PMA. So I love talking about this stuff. I love getting to meet other product marketing managers or product marketing experts. It's one of the reasons why I love hosting the podcast. So I'm super excited to be here today and chat in front of all of you and hopefully get to chat with you afterwards, whether it's immediately afterwards or down the road, because I think product marketing is one of the most exciting and dynamic spaces in all of marketing, arguably in all of tech right now. So super excited to be here and represent as best I can. So I'm going to talk about how product marketing can approach prioritizing go-to-market activities, especially not just in crowded markets, but at organizations where your product teams are releasing things all the time, right? Like we've all been product marketers at some point where there is maybe 3 product teams, 4 product teams, 6 product teams, and you're maybe supporting all of them all by yourself. And when you're constantly being bombarded with different releases, sometimes early in the process than others, it can be challenging to manage how much of attention, not just yourself, but the broader org should be given to that given release. So I'm going to provide a framework how to essentially approach that problem. A couple of people get this. You've probably heard this, I know you've at least heard this twice today already, so I'm not breaking any new grounds, a bit of exaggeration on my end here, but markets are crowded, right? And someone mentioned it earlier today, but in their Slack channel, every other week it seems like there's a new competitor popping up, right? Raise your hand if you find yourself in an org where that's the case. A couple of hands, yeah, lots of hands, yeah. There's always something happening. Proof is in the pudding here. This is something that I know was shown earlier in the day, a nice graphic of all the different MarTech companies, 8,000. Can you imagine having to compete in that space? I'm sure some of you do right now, but that's incredibly challenging to stay on top of. Not alone what you are doing to remain competitive, but what your competitors are up to and how you compare. It's just so much happening. And when that happens, there's implications for us as product marketing managers. First and foremost, attention is incredibly limited amongst our customers, I should say. How many of you are customers of companies where it seems like every week, maybe multiple times a month, you're receiving emails about the latest and greatest feature that they've released, or this minor update and this major update? It becomes a lot to stay on top of, right? And you almost kind of tune out. So imagine if you're a customer of a company that does that, how your customers might feel if every month you're sending them 5 or 6 different communications about new functionality in your product. Eventually, you're just going to lose them. Now imagine if they subscribe to some of your competitors' releases, updates, or community newsletters. How do you stay on top of that? How do you expect a customer to stay engaged and to actually want to continue to listen to you? It's very hard for them to do that. The other challenge here is that true innovation in crowded markets is rare. And when I say true innovation, I mean something net new that the market or category has never seen before, right? We're always trying to keep up with our competitors, offer functionality that they offer, remain competitive. But it's not often that you're going to market with something that has never before been seen, right? Or typically spend most of our time playing catch up. Unless you happen to find yourself at the market leader that can take those big risks and those big swings and release something new, but not all of us are that fortunate. The last piece I'll touch on here is that new is incredibly expensive, right? We all know that the cost of acquisition has only increased over time, not just because of this competition, but because the channels that you leverage to buy new customers know that competition is intense, so they can charge more for that competition. So you really have to ask yourself, should we always be focused on constant growth? To an extent, absolutely. That's how businesses grow and survive. But how much of our efforts should be focused on retention and keeping the customers we have happy by offering them features that are going to keep them with us over the long term? All that is to say is something has to change. And I know actually Mark referenced this earlier in his talk, so no shade to the folks at Intercom that came up with this. It's a great framework. But I don't think this is really relevant anymore. This was actually put out into the space in 2006 by a gentleman at Intercom. And I think at that time, things weren't probably as competitive, especially in the SaaS space, as they are today. And it's worked. But there are a couple ways that this prioritization framework specifically fails us. First, when there is so much competition, and as I said earlier, there's very limited true innovation, if all your P1s are based around something that's net new to market to attract new customers, your chances of actually doing a P1 are quite minimal, right? No one gets into product marketing to do go-to-market functions and never do anything exciting or anything big or new, right? We want to do the big, exciting P1 stuff. But when you frame all your P1s around something that has to be net new, how often are you really going to be able to do that? Not very, most likely. The other problem I have with this framework is that it prioritizes acquiring new customers over retaining existing ones. And as I said earlier, as the cost of acquiring new customers only increases, can we really definitively say that acquiring is inherently more important than retention? Not always. Depends on the stage of your company's growth, the maturity of the market, how intense the competition in that market is. So I think if you look at that previous framework, just to assume that acquisition is greater than retention is a bit of a misstep. Lastly, it really fails to focus on the customer. As product marketers, we have it drilled into our heads that we need to be customer obsessed at all times. So when you leverage a framework that nowhere on it references what's the impact of the customer, I think you're inherently going to set yourself up to fail. Okay? Customers aren't always won over by the new shiny thing, right? We've talked about the feature bombardment, always being shown what's new, what's exciting. Customers eventually get numb to that, right? So you need to focus on what the value to the customer is. And fortunately enough, the framework I'm going to show you is going to address that in a little bit. So I want to ask a question to the group. How many of you can say that you've launched anything, let's say over the past 6 months, that's truly new? I mean, never before seen in your market, and none of your competitors are doing it. I see a couple hands. Okay, but I would say the majority of the room likely playing or releasing Me Too features or catch-up features. Nothing wrong with that, but again, I just think it points to the fact that true innovation is rare and it's hard to come across. Okay, another question. How many of you have launched a P1 this year? Couple hands. What about more than one? Okay, one, maybe two hands. Again, nothing wrong with that, but I don't know about you, I got into product marketing to do exciting and fun go-to-market launches. Like that's, to me, part of the big appeal of being in product marketing. So when I go to a company and I find out, oh, you're maybe gonna get to do a P1 once a year, once every couple of years, well, that kind of takes the fun out of go-to-market, at least for me personally. So I think if we lean on that previous framework, your opportunities to do P1s become so small that it kind of takes the fun out of go-to-market motions, again, at least for me. So I think suffice to say, we deserve better, speaking selfishly, right? We as product marketers, we deserve to have a framework that sets us up for as many opportunities to get excited about the go-to-market activities that we're driving, but still having a very customer-focused lens applied to those activities. Like I said, our customers deserve better too, right? We don't want to just be throwing out go-to-market motions and activities that we feel like we have to do, otherwise product's going to be breathing down our neck, otherwise senior leadership's going to be wondering why we're not talking about anything new. But it has to ultimately resonate with our customers, otherwise why are we doing it? So, saying that we deserve better, I would argue that it's time for something new. It's time for a framework that prioritizes the customer value and the broader business value, right? We work for businesses. We have to have both of those things in mind. And I would argue that that sounds good in theory, and it's easy for me to say, but I think at a lot of organizations, truly defining not just the business value of a go-to-market activity or a net new piece of product, and the customer value can be challenging, especially when it comes to getting alignment. Right? You might get some teams saying, oh, we really need to focus on this part of the product because ultimately our customers care about X. And then you might go to another team and say, oh, we really need to be focusing on this part of the product because ultimately customers care about Y. Well, shouldn't they be saying the same thing? I have worked at a number of organizations and I've been surprised how often that has come up where different teams will define customer value differently. It's a red flag, obviously, but it just goes to show that the clearly shared and widely held definition of customer value for a given org needs to be defined. So here's the solution, okay? I alluded to earlier, if you forget everything I talk about today, there's gonna be at least one slide to remember. This is that slide, okay? This is a simple framework that myself and a couple of very talented others at Jobber have been working on for the past little while that looks at not just the business value and why any given net new piece of product or product activity we should care about it and the impact to the business, but also what the impact to the customer is as well, right? Because ultimately you want to try and do something that aligns across both of those axes. So I'm gonna dig a bit deeper into each of those axes and define them a little bit. But before I do that, I just want to briefly touch on why the team and I landed on this framework and really what the benefits of it are, relative to the framework I showed earlier. First and foremost, it's very simple. We intentionally set out to define a framework that didn't require additional spreadsheets. It didn't require, calculations or, let me just, plug in some numbers and get some values to define to provide some definitions of what their priority are, okay? It's also very easy. I think you could show this to anybody outside their product marketing org, and they would be able to get it, right? Like they would look at this and be like, this makes sense to me. I don't need to understand the minutia of go-to-market and positioning. I can look at this and understand why a given activity has been assigned a given priority. It also acts as a guide. You'll see as I define both customer and business value that it's directional in nature, okay? It's not meant to say, oh, we definitively can say that this piece of functionality or net new release has to have this priority, right? It puts you in the right direction, and that allows you to have the conversation with your partners within product marketing and product to ultimately land on that final priority, okay? It's also directional for the product team and the broader product org. What I mean by that is when you're looking at the long-term not go-to-market, but product roadmap for the quarter or the year. And if you use this tool and you start assigning priorities to different planned pieces of functionality, and at the end of that you say, we don't really have any P1s happening this year. Again, a red flag that you can raise to the product team and say, hey, we're not doing enough to really drive both customer and business value. And that should start a conversation and challenge your partners in product to really question their assumptions. Why are we doing this? If we're not really doing anything that deserves P1 this year, are we okay with that? So it helps provide that product kind of direction and it adjusts trajectory where it's needed. Again, it aligns on value. It forces the chat, as I've called it, not the chat that you may have had with your parents growing up, but the chat of how do we define business value and customer value, right? Again, some teams might define these things differently, but with this framework, it forces you to sit down with your key stakeholders and say like, okay, let's be very clear. Do we all agree on what business value is and what the value to the customer we are driving truly is? And at the end of that conversation, you should be able to walk away from and be like, yeah, like we agree on what those two things are. That's super critical for long-term success of the biz. And then lastly, it's flexible. So again, I'll give a definition of business value and then customer value, but depending on where your business is in their stage of growth, maybe even what your competitors are doing, you can tweak the definitions of both customer and business value to reevaluate priority of a given set of upcoming functionality. Maybe in a given quarter, the business is really focused on top line revenue growth. Maybe they're really focused on cutting costs one quarter. So you can redefine the values across the axes depending on where your business is at that point in time. So I'll quickly define business value. So as we know, businesses exist to generate a profit, right? I don't think I'm breaking any new ground by saying that. So really, if you're looking at a net new piece of functionality and how to define the value it's driving to the business, you want to ask yourself, is there a direct impact on profit, right? Are we able to acquire new customers? Are we increasing a customer lifetime value or retention? Are we able to generate some cost savings with this new piece of functionality? If the answers to those are yes, then I would argue that's a direct impact on profit, and that should be a high business value. The moderate impact to business value is an indirect impact on profit. So these are things that improve core KPIs that ultimately lead into profitability. They provide new expansion opportunities, or there's a positive brand lift, okay? So it doesn't necessarily have to be a quantifiable money line item piece for this moderate value. It could just say, hey, we can go to market with this new piece of functionality and tell a better story that reflects positively on the brand or on us within our broader customer community. And then lastly, you're thinking about no measurable impact to profit. So these are things like your quality of life improvements, your bug fixes, your UI, UX. And these are things that you would typically not do much, if anything, for, but at least allows you to go to a product team that might be working on a bug fix for several sprints and say, hey, I know this is a lot of work and it's taking a lot of your time, but really the business value, this is like a need to do, not we truly want to do this, so it's going to be prioritized accordingly as a result. Customer value. No, this isn't a mistake. This is intentionally blank, okay? And that's because customer value is truly going to be defined by your business, the customers you serve, and the markets you operate in, okay? So for example, I used to work at a two-sided marketplace for freelance creatives, okay? To us, we would define customer value for our freelancers as the ability for them to get more work and land more jobs. So anything that had a direct impact on those freelancers' ability to generate more work, I would define as having a high customer value, okay? Other things like their ability to more quickly send out proposals, or even just like more quickly interact with customers, that would have a moderate to low impact on customer value. Another example, if I look at a company like Jobber that offers business management software to home service providers, if we can help our home service providers be more profitable, because at the end of the day, that's probably what they care about most, then that would arguably be a high customer value piece of functionality. So that's how you should approach this, is whatever you define as your holy grail of customer value, if there is a tangible direct impact on that, then it automatically gets a high rating. And then you kind of work your way backwards from indirect to almost none. Okay, I'm gonna shift gears a little bit. That's the framework. I wanna talk about kind of where it comes into play in the product development cycle, and then finish with who needs to be involved in rolling this framework out, right? Product marketing, we love to use our frameworks. We like to go into our laptops or our desks or offices and play with our fun toys. But if other teams don't understand those toys or why we're using them, you're not gonna get much buy-in. So I'll touch on that at the end. Question for the group, how many of you have been brought into the product development cycle 2, 3, 4 weeks before release? Everybody, I'm sure, at some point, right? Like, we've all felt that pain. It sucks. It happens all too often, okay? Ideally, with a framework like this, you're able to get in front of the product teams way earlier in that process. Now, I'm not saying that this is the fix, because there's a lot of other stuff that has to go in the right way for this framework to be applied earlier on, but this should at least help you understand where this prioritization conversation should be taking place and where this framework can start to be leveraged to, again, ballpark that priority and begin that prioritization conversation. So I'm sure people have probably seen this before, depending on the product environment they support. We've got these 5 stages of development: define, discover, design, develop, and deploy. So again, if we think about the define stage, we're exploring what problems are worth solving. And you can ask that question against what's the customer value, what's the business value. And through that conversation, you should be able to very early on ballpark what the GTM priority of that work could hypothetically be. When you move on to the discover phase, you're essentially evaluating, but again, almost re-evaluating what the value of that potential solution to that problem is. So if you've kind of ballparked the priority of that problem, once you've defined the solution itself, if this is what we know what we're going to go to market with, what is that ultimate final priority? And then lastly, you look at the deploy phase when things go live. It's the execution stage. This is when you're doing the go-to-market activities that you have assigned to each priority. And you can then evaluate, okay, if this was a P1 and we did all of these things because it was a P1, what success did we expect to achieve? And did that success tie back to that specific business value we were trying to drive? Okay? If it doesn't, then you can ask yourself, was it a problem with the product itself? Is it a problem with how we're measuring the performance of that piece of product? Or is it a problem with how we're defining that business value? So again, you're basically, although it says deploy and executing, you're again still evaluating the effectiveness of the framework once things are now in market. All right, so last slide here. Product isn't the only key to getting alignment on this work though, right? Obviously you wanna make sure that product is tied into this work and bought into this framework, but there are other people that would really benefit from rolling out this framework and getting them to be engaged on. So first and foremost, you've got your marketing partners. You should be able to go to your marketing team and say, hey, this quarter, we've got a P2, a P3, and we've got the elusive P1. Very exciting stuff. And they should be able to go into that conversation and say, or come out of that conversation and say, okay, based on that, I know how to allocate my resources to make sure that we're able to deliver on all the material we need to make those launches a success, okay? So it helps from a capacity and planning standpoint well before the go-to-market conversation and the actual tactics themselves begin to get developed. So that's super critical there. Lastly, or sorry, not lastly, but next we have our sales partners, okay? Again, lots of releases going on at any given org. It's often not hard just for product marketers to stay on top of it, but for our sales partners as well. They're constantly seeing in Slack, this release is going live today. This release is going live today. If I'm in sales and I ultimately need to communicate those new pieces of functionality to potential customers, it's very challenging for me to stay up on that constant flow of updates. But with a prioritization framework like this, I can tune into P1s, P2s, maybe P3s, probably P4s I can just skip over, right? So it allows them to understand, oh, these are the things that I should be really paying attention to because of the impact not just to the customer, but for the business as well. So there's just a way to orient around how much time and effort should I be focusing during my sales conversation potentially around these new pieces of functionality. And then lastly, similar logic applies to our success partners. So if you've got setup teams, if you've got customer success managers that are doing regular touch points with accounts, they can go to quarterly or monthly updates and say, oh, hey, did you know we released XYZ? And those XYZ items are only P1s, P2s, with a maybe occasional P3. So this allows them to understand going into that conversation what's worth spending the time focusing on in terms of net new functionality. So they're only focusing on the things that the customer are going to care about, right? No customer wants to sit in that kind of conversation and just have a list of new things thrown at them. Because again, they've probably already heard it from emails. They've probably already received an in-product notification. Those conversations are very limited in time, and they only happen sometimes once a quarter. You're going to want to make sure that your success partners are focusing on the things that are going to drive not just business value, but the most customer value as well. Alrighty, that's it. That's the framework. That's where it should be deployed in the product development process and who really needs to be bought into it. Before I wrap up, I do want to say a special thanks to the team I alluded to earlier, many of whom are in the room today, who helped bring the framework to life. It is something that we are trying out and actively applying at Jobber, and I encourage you to try and break it, as it were, if you decide to adopt it yourself, and give me feedback on what works and what doesn't work, because we're doing the same internally. But shout out to these folks for help bringing it to life. And then also just a couple of non-Jobber folk that I've been working with to refine this framework. Rachel Lambert, who runs a product marketing agency, Olivine, she's going to kill me because I probably got it wrong, the right way to say it. She's doing some great work. I would recommend checking her out. And then Derek Osgood, he runs a company called Ignition that's focused exclusively on go-to-market tooling for product marketing managers. So can't recommend him enough, I should say. And his company has been doing some work from with the PMA over the last several months. So some great resources available from his team as well. Alrighty, that's it. You can find me on LinkedIn for that feedback. I thank you so much for your time.
That's awesome. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Love that framework. As this comes up, anyone got a question they want to? Actually, here it is. Okay, perfect.
Perfect.
Brandon, it's on the ball. Do you use the same customer value measure for all of your products, or do you choose different measures for different products?
Yeah, great question. That's the flexibility of the model. If you work at an organization that supports multiple product lines and they are very different in terms of their functionality set, then absolutely you could tweak the customer value definition to align better to what that value that product is delivering, okay? It doesn't have to be a one size fits all. That's the flexibility of it. However, if you are supporting one product that does a lot of different things, ideally your customer value is consistent across all of those different things. It just sets a nice baseline and it's consistent, and it also helps with those conversations with those internal teams so they're not constantly having to context shift and adjust to new definitions of customer value.
Do you ever, just as an idea or a thought, do you ever provide like examples so you can be like, hey, for example, on this launch, we ranked this as and here's why?
Absolutely, great question. As we begin to roll this framework out internally at Jobber, that was one of the first things we did with the product team is we showed each of these different tiers and these different applications across that 3x3 with specific examples that we had launched or were planning on launching in the next short while. So we could say, oh, hey, this specific thing that we're working on, this would be defined as a P1. It just helps them contextualize real functionality.
Totally, makes sense. What about opportunities with high business value but only in the long term versus a moderate one that might materialize short term?
Yeah, great question. That's the one thing that the framework, I will admit, doesn't really account for directly. That's part of that subjectivity piece where, again, the framework should put you in a ballpark to then say, okay, if we know this is going to have a high business value, but it might not be for 6 months from now, 12 months from now, 24 months from now, is this a P1 or should it be maybe demoted to a P2, I should say. But then again, as you get closer to that piece of functionality, ultimately realizing that end goal of business value, whether it's 6 months, 12 months down the road, you can say, okay, we need to now revisit this piece of functionality and do another blast across all of our channels to get people and our customers excited about it because we're starting to see the fruits of that labor pay off.
Makes sense. At Jobber, how do the different release tiers translate into go-to-market? So are there any differences between the priorities?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I caught from this presentation, just because it is so different depending on the org that you work out and the channels that you leverage, but for each priority, you would have a different list of customer-facing and internal tactics that you would leverage based on that priority. So as you would expect, P1, you're probably going to do the most amount of tactics that you're going to do, okay? For P2, slightly less. For P3, even fewer. P4, probably none, okay? So that's how that ultimately gets applied to the tactical execution. The higher priority the piece of product functionality or release has, the more things you're going to do to promote it to your customers. Because again, it's going to have a higher customer value, so they should inherently get more excited about it. So you want as many people as possible to know.
In a prioritization model like this, there's always a risk, I guess, that P4s go stale indefinitely, and we continually latch on to the P3 or P2 opportunities. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in any product org, there's going to be, again, those pieces of functionality or bug fixes that no one really gets excited to address, but have to get done. And those are ultimately going to get relegated to P4, maybe the odd P3. And that's just the nature of working in dynamic product orgs. They're always working on things. So I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with doing quite a few P3s and P4s if they are necessary. But again, what I referenced earlier is if you find, whether it's in the given quarter or on the roadmap, you're doing a lot of those P3s and P4s, that should give you the ammunition, for lack of a better word, to go back to your product partners and say, hey, from a customer and business value perspective, this roadmap is concerning because we're not really delivering anything valuable to our customers. Should we reevaluate things? And they might come back at you and say, like, no, go home, like pound salt, and that's okay. But at least you can say, as a product marketer, you did your work and you were the voice of the customer in that setting to fight for more P2s and P1s landing on the roadmap.
Time for one more question. How can you get product teams to collaborate to line up their mutually beneficial releases so that you can combine them into a more valuable P2, P1?
Great question. And this is actually another one of the benefits of the framework that I just didn't have time to speak to, was that, again, in the process of looking at your roadmap, if you see that you have a bunch of P2s or a bunch of P3s, maybe in a smattering of P4s, it allows you to pursue opportunities to group them together to build a more cohesive and exciting story. So you might have like 3 or 4 P3s in a given quarter that in isolation don't do anything overly exciting. But if you were to combine them into a broader story of like, hey, we released these 4 pieces of functionality and they all contribute to, insert definition of customer value, you can generate more hype that way. And it also just reduces the burden of like constantly bombarding your customers with a high quantity of like lower value release notes. Instead, you bundle those into one big announcement and just ideally land more of a splash.
Love that. Mark, thanks so much. Everyone,
Thank
let's
you
hear it for Mark.